The Lycan king had not been touched in 200 years. Everyone in the kingdom knew the story. A witch's curse, cast in vengeance when he'd executed her son for crimes against his people. She'd made him untouchable, literally. Anyone who laid hands on King Caelan felt their skin burn as if pressed against molten iron. The pain was blinding, instantaneous. Those who tried to save him in battle, those who accidentally brushed against him in crowds, even the lovers who'd once warmed his bed, all of them had screamed and recoiled, their flesh marked with angry red welts that took weeks to heal. So the king lived alone. No handshakes, no embraces, no comfort. 2 centuries of isolation had made him cold, distant. The warmth he'd once been known for had frozen over, leaving only duty and efficiency behind. Ilara knew none of this when she was dragged into the great hall. She was a kitchen servant, the lowest of the low in the castle hierarchy. 22 years old, orphaned at 6, passed between relatives who saw her as a burden until she'd ended up here, scrubbing pots and sleeping in a storage closet beside the root cellar. She hadn't spoken in 3 years, not since her last guardian had beaten her so badly for speaking out of turn that something inside her had simply stopped. She could speak. Physically, there was nothing wrong with her voice, but the words wouldn't come. They stayed locked behind her teeth, trapped by a fear so deep it had become part of her. No one noticed her. That was fine. Being invisible meant being safe. But tonight, she'd made a mistake. The winter feast was the grandest event of the year. Every noble in the kingdom attended, and the kitchen had been chaos for days. Ilara had been carrying a tray of empty goblets back from the hall when she'd tripped, stumbled directly into Lord Marin, one of the king's advisors, and spilled wine dregs across his expensive velvet coat. He'd grabbed her by the arm and hauled her into the great hall before she could even process what was happening. "Your Majesty!" Lord Marin's voice rang out, silencing the musicians. "This clumsy wretch has ruined my garments. I demand she be punished publicly, as an example to the other servants." Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs. The great hall was enormous. Vaulted ceilings, roaring fireplaces, hundreds of nobles in glittering finery. And at the far end, on a raised dais, sat the Lycan king. She'd never seen him up close before. From a distance, he'd been just a figure, tall, broad-shouldered, always surrounded by space. Now she understood why. He was beautiful in the way a winter storm was beautiful. Dark hair, silver at the temples despite a face that looked no older than 35. Pale grey eyes that seemed to see everything and feel nothing. Sharp features, strong jaw, lips pressed into a line that suggested he'd forgotten how to smile. He sat alone. No one on either side of him. No guards within arm's reach. The throne beside his, the Queen's throne, sat empty, covered in dust. Those cold eyes found her, and Ilara stopped breathing. What did she do? His voice was low, rough, like he didn't use it often. "Spilled wine on me." Lord Marin shoved her forward. "Look at her. She's not even apologizing. Mute or defiant, I don't care which. She should be whipped." Ilara's legs trembled. She wanted to speak, to beg, to explain, but the words were locked away, as always. All she could do was stand there, head bowed, waiting for the pain she knew was coming. The king studied her for a long moment. "You!" His voice made her flinch. "Look at me." She raised her head slowly, met his eyes. Something flickered in their grey depths. Surprise, maybe, or curiosity. She didn't know why. She was nothing. a scrap of a girl in a stained kitchen dress, shaking like a leaf. "Did you do it on purpose?" She shook her head. "Can you speak?" She hesitated, then shook her head again. It was easier than explaining. The king's jaw tightened. He turned to Lord Marin. "You want me to whip a mute servant girl for an accident?" She should have been more careful. "Get out of my sight, Marin, and consider yourself fortunate I don't have you whipped for wasting my time with this nonsense." Lord Marin spluttered, but he released Ilara's arm and stormed away, leaving her standing alone in the middle of the great hall. Every noble was staring. The music had stopped. She didn't know what to do. Bow? Run? Her mind had gone blank with fear and confusion. The king rose from his throne. A collective intake of breath rippled through the hall. He never left the dais during feasts, never came close to the crowds. But he descended the steps now, slow and deliberate, and walked toward her. People scrambled out of his path. No one wanted to risk touching him accidentally. He stopped 3 feet away, the closest anyone had stood to him in years. "You're afraid," he said quietly. Not a question. She nodded. "Of me?" Another nod. Something shifted in his expression. Pain, maybe? Or just resignation. "Everyone is." He turned to leave. And Ilara did something she couldn't explain. Something that made no sense, that defied every survival instinct she'd honed over years of abuse and invisibility. She reached out and caught his hand. The hall erupted in screams. Ilara heard shouts of warning, gasps of horror, but she didn't feel pain. No burning, no agony, just warmth. His hand was large and calloused, slightly cool against her palm, and it was trembling. The king had gone rigid. He stared at their joined hands like he was seeing a ghost. "You're not burning," he whispered. Ilara didn't understand. She looked at their hands, her small, work-roughened fingers wrapped around his, and then back at his face. The cold mask had cracked. Beneath it, she saw something raw and desperate and afraid. "How?" His voice broke on the word. "How are you not burning?" She couldn't answer. She didn't know. All she knew was that he looked like a man who'd been wandering in the dark for a very long time, and her touch had become unexpected light. The nobles were still frozen, watching in stunned silence. The king lifted his free hand, slowly like approaching a frightened animal, and brushed his fingertips against her cheek. His breath caught, his eyes closed. "You can feel that?" he asked. She nodded. "It doesn't hurt?" She shook her head. When he opened his eyes again, they were bright with something that might have been tears. "What's your name?" She couldn't tell him, but someone called out from the crowd, one of the other kitchen servants, voice shaking. Ilara, Your Majesty. Her name is Ilara." "Ilara." He said it like a prayer, like a promise, like the first word of a new language he was desperate to learn. He hadn't let go of her hand. Neither had she. The king led her out of the great hall through a side door, away from the staring eyes and whispered speculation. His hand remained wrapped around hers, gently, like he was holding something precious and breakable, like he was afraid she might dissolve if he gripped too tight. Ilara's mind was spinning. She didn't understand what was happening. Why wasn't she burning? Why was the king, the untouchable, unreachable Lycan king, holding her hand like she mattered? He brought her to a private study, fire crackling in the hearth, walls lined with books, heavy curtains drawn against the winter night. It was warm, comfortable. Nothing like the cold storage closet where she slept. He released her hand only to close the door, and even then, his fingers lingered, reluctant. "Please," he said, gesturing to a chair by the fire. "Sit." She sat. Her legs were trembling too badly to do anything else. The king didn't sit. He paced. 3 steps one way, 3 steps back. His composure had cracked wide open, and beneath it was something almost frantic. 200 years, he said finally, stopping to face her. "Do you understand? 200 years since anyone has touched me without screaming, without burning. I had given up. I thought I would live the rest of my very long life without ever feeling another person's skin against mine." Ilara watched him. She didn't know what to do with the raw emotion in his voice. Men in her experience didn't show vulnerability. They showed anger, cruelty, indifference. Not this. Not desperate, aching hope. "The witch who cursed me," he continued, "she said only one thing could break it. She laughed when she said it, because she knew it was impossible. She said only my true mate, my fated one, could touch me without harm." He stopped pacing, looked at her with those grey eyes that suddenly seemed less cold and more like winter sky after snowfall. "Do you know what that means?" Ilara shook her head slowly. "It means you're mine." His voice dropped. "It means you were made for me. That somewhere in the fabric of fate, your soul and mine were woven together. It means I have been waiting 2 centuries for you, and I didn't even know it." She stared at him. This couldn't be real. She was nobody. A silent servant girl with no family, no voice, no worth. Kings didn't have fated mates who scrubbed pots in the kitchen. Her disbelief must have shown on her face, because he laughed, a broken, hollow sound. "You don't believe me." She shook her head again, not to be defiant, just honest. "I wouldn't believe me either." He moved closer, slowly, and knelt in front of her chair. It put them at eye level. A king kneeling before a servant. "Ilara, I'm not going to force you into anything. I know what people say about Lycan mates, that the bond compels, that there's no choice. But I won't do that to you. I've lived 200 years without touch. I can wait longer if you need time." She frowned, confused. Wait for what? He seemed to read the question in her expression. "Wait for you to trust me, to know me, to decide if you want this, want me, of your own free will." He reached out, hesitated, then carefully took her hand again. The touch sent warmth spreading up her arm. "You've been hurt. I can see it. The way you flinch at sudden movements, the way you expect pain. Someone taught you that you were worthless, and I intend to spend however long it takes proving them wrong." Ilara's throat tightened. No one had ever spoken to her like this. No one had ever looked at her and seen anything worth saving. She wanted to tell him he was wasting his time, that she was broken in ways that couldn't be fixed, that her silence wasn't just habit. It was armor, and she didn't know how to take it off. But she couldn't say any of that, so she just sat there, tears burning in her eyes, while a king knelt at her feet and held her hand like she was something precious. "First things first," he said, his tone shifting to something more practical. "You're not sleeping in the servants' quarters anymore. I'm having a room prepared for you." She shook her head quickly, panic flashing through her. "Not my chambers," he added gently. "Your own room, private, with a lock on the inside that only you control. You'll have clothes, food, anything you need. And tomorrow I'll introduce you to my court physician, not because anything is wrong with you." He squeezed her hand. but because I want to make sure you're healthy, that you're being cared for properly. Ilara didn't know what to do with any of this. Kindness felt like a trap. It always had been before. The king studied her face. "You're waiting for the catch." She nodded. "There isn't one." He released her hand and stood. "I know you don't believe that yet, but I'll prove it. Every day, for as long as it takes." A servant arrived with tea and food. Warm bread, cheese, sliced fruit. More food than Ilara usually saw in a week. The king dismissed the servant and served her himself, pouring her tea, setting the plate in front of her. "Eat," he said. "When was the last time you had a full meal?" She couldn't remember. She picked up the bread, took a small bite. It was fresh, soft. She hadn't tasted fresh bread in years. "Can I ask you something?" The king settled into the chair across from her, maintaining a respectful distance. "You can nod or shake your head. I won't push." She nodded cautiously. "Your silence. Were you born unable to speak, or did something happen?" Ilara hesitated. This was the question she dreaded, the one that required her to revisit memories she'd locked away. But something about the way he asked, patient, without pressure, genuinely curious rather than demanding, made her want to try. She held up 3 fingers. 3 years, he interpreted. "You've been silent for 3 years." She nodded. "Someone hurt you." It wasn't a question, but she nodded anyway. Her hand drifted unconsciously to her throat, to the faded scar hidden beneath her collar. The king's expression darkened. Not at her. She could tell the difference. This was rage on her behalf. Protective fury. "Who?" His voice was soft, but there was steel beneath it. She shook her head. It didn't matter anymore. The man was dead, killed in a tavern brawl 2 winters ago. She'd felt nothing when she heard the news, just hollow relief. "You don't have to tell me," the king said. "Not now. Not ever, if you don't want to." But Ilara... He leaned forward, holding her gaze. "I need you to understand something. You are safe now. Whatever happened to you, whoever hurt you, they will never touch you again. I will burn down anyone who tries." She believed him. That was the terrifying part. Looking into his eyes, she believed every word, and she didn't know what to do with that. Later, a maid escorted her to her new room. It was larger than any space she'd ever occupied. A real bed with actual blankets, a wardrobe, a window overlooking the snow-covered gardens. A fire already crackled in the small hearth. On the bed lay a nightgown, soft cotton, finer than anything she'd ever worn. Ilara stood in the middle of the room, overwhelmed. This morning she'd been invisible. Tonight she was... what? The king's fated mate? The answer to a 200-year-old curse? It didn't feel real. She changed into the nightgown, crawled into the bed, and pulled the blankets up to her chin. The sheets smelled clean. The pillow was soft. She thought about the king's hand around hers, the way he'd looked at her, like she was a miracle. For the first time in 3 years, something warm flickered in her chest. She didn't trust it yet, but she didn't push it away either. The nightmare came 3 nights later. Ilara woke gasping, tangled in sweat-soaked sheets, her throat raw from a scream that hadn't made it past her lips. The same dream, always the same. Hands around her neck, a voice telling her she was worthless. Pain blooming across her face, her ribs, her back. She sat up, trembling, and pulled her knees to her chest. The fire had burned low. Shadows crawled across the walls. A knock at the door made her flinch. "Ilara!" The king's voice, muffled through the wood. I felt something. Are you all right?" She didn't know how to answer. She couldn't call out, and she wasn't sure she wanted him to see her like this, shaking, tear-streaked, broken open by memories she couldn't escape. But he didn't wait. The door opened slowly, just enough for him to peer inside. "May I come in?" She nodded before she could think better of it. He entered carefully, wearing a simple linen shirt and dark trousers, not the formal attire she'd seen him in before. His feet were bare. His hair was slightly disheveled. He looked almost human. "Nightmare?" he asked softly. She nodded again. He didn't approach the bed. Instead, he settled into the chair by the dying fire, giving her space. "I have them too. 200 years of them. Some nights are worse than others." Ilara watched him in the dim light. She'd never thought about what his life must have been like. Centuries of isolation. Centuries of watching everyone he cared about age and die while he remained frozen in time. Centuries of wanting to be touched and knowing the attempt would only cause pain. "The curse," he continued, staring into the embers. "It wasn't just about physical touch. It was about connection. The witch knew that. She wanted me to suffer in every way possible, to be surrounded by people and completely alone at the same time." He looked at her then, and something in his expression made her breath catch. "Do you know what it's like to watch someone you love recoil from you? To see fear in the eyes of everyone who gets too close? After a while, you stop trying. You build walls. You become the monster they expect, because at least then the distance makes sense." Ilara understood that, more than she could say. She'd built her own walls. Silence instead of stone. Invisibility instead of intimidation. Different materials. Same purpose. She slid out of bed, wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, and crossed the room to sit in the chair across from him. Close enough to touch, if she wanted to. His eyes tracked her movement. Hopeful. Careful. She reached out and took his hand. The tension drained from his shoulders. He turned her hand over in his, tracing the calluses on her palm, the roughness of skin that had scrubbed too many pots and carried too many heavy loads. "These hands," he murmured. "They've worked so hard, done so much, and no one ever thanked you for any of it, did they?" She shook her head. "Tell me about your life before. Not the pain. I know that story already. I can read it in your scars. Tell me something else. Something good, if there was anything good." Ilara thought for a long moment. Good memories were hard to find. But there was one. She mimed reading a book. "You like to read?" She nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Can you read? Did someone teach you?" Another nod. She held up 6 fingers, then mimed a woman's shape. "Your mother taught you when you were 6?" "Yes." "Before she died?" Ilara's smile faded. She nodded once more. "I'm sorry." He squeezed her hand gently. "But I'm glad she gave you that. Words are powerful things, even the ones we can't speak out loud." He paused. "The library here has over 10,000 volumes. It's yours. Anything you want to read, anytime you want to read it." Her eyes widened. She'd seen the library doors from a distance, but had never dared to enter. Servants weren't allowed. "You're not a servant anymore," he said, reading her expression. "You're my mate, my equal. Everything I have is yours." Equal. The word felt foreign. No one had ever treated her as an equal, not once in her entire life. "I mean it, Ilara." He leaned forward, holding her gaze with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "I don't want a servant or a subordinate. I don't want someone who obeys me out of fear or obligation. I want a partner, someone who challenges me, someone who sees me, really sees me, and chooses to stay anyway." She wanted to ask why. Why her? Why would a king who could have anyone want a broken, silent girl with nothing to offer? But she couldn't ask. And maybe he sensed the question anyway, because he continued. "I've met thousands of women over the centuries, nobles, warriors, scholars, beauties that entire kingdoms fought wars over. None of them could touch me. None of them were meant for me." His thumb traced circles on the back of her hand. "And then you, a kitchen servant who hadn't spoken in 3 years, walked into my great hall and reached for my hand without hesitation. Do you know how brave that was? Everyone else ran. Everyone else flinched away. But you reached out." She hadn't felt brave. She'd felt compelled, like something deeper than thought had moved her hand toward his. "That's the mate bond," he said softly. "It recognized what your mind hadn't yet understood, that we belong together, that you're not broken, Ilara. You're exactly what I need, what I've always needed." Tears slipped down her cheeks. She couldn't help it. No one had ever called her brave. No one had ever suggested she was needed. He reached up slowly, giving her time to pull away, and brushed the tears from her face. His touch was gentle, reverent. "You're not worthless," he whispered. "I don't know who told you that, but they were wrong. They were so wrong. You're treasure, Ilara. You're the answer to a prayer I stopped believing in 100 years ago." She was crying harder now, silent sobs that shook her shoulders. He didn't try to stop her or tell her to calm down. He just held her hand and let her fall apart. When the tears finally subsided, she felt emptied out, hollow, but in a clean way, like a wound that had been lanced. He was still there, still holding her hand, still looking at her like she mattered. She shifted forward in her chair, closing the distance between them. His breath caught. She could see his pulse jumping in his throat. Slowly, carefully, she lifted her free hand and pressed it against his chest, over his heart. It was racing, pounding against her palm like it was trying to break free. "Ilara." Her name was a rough whisper. "If you keep touching me like that, I'm going to have a very hard time being patient." She should have pulled away, should have retreated to the safety of distance. Instead, she leaned closer, close enough to feel his breath on her lips. He made a sound low in his throat, half groan, half prayer. His hand came up to cup her face, tilting it toward his. "Tell me to stop," he breathed. "If you don't want this, tell me to stop." She couldn't tell him anything, but she could show him. She closed the distance and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was soft, tentative, a question more than a statement. He answered by pulling her closer, one hand tangled in her hair, the other wrapped around her waist. He kissed her like she was oxygen, and he'd been drowning for 200 years. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, he pressed his forehead against hers. "I've waited so long for you," he whispered. "So long." She couldn't say it back, but she felt it. A warmth spreading through her chest, melting ice she hadn't known was there. She was falling for him, this impossible king who knelt at her feet and called her treasure. She was terrified, But for the first time in years, she was also hoping. A week passed, the happiest week of Ilara's life. She spent her mornings in the library, surrounded by more books than she'd ever imagined existed. She spent her afternoons with Callan. She'd started thinking of him by his name now, not just his title. Walking through the castle gardens or sitting by the fire while he handled matters of state. He always kept her close, always found reasons to touch her. A hand on her shoulder, fingers brushing hers. Small points of contact that seemed to anchor him to reality. She was starting to believe this might be real. Then Lord Marin returned. He'd been absent from court since the night of the feast, nursing his wounded pride in his country estate. But wounded pride had a way of festering into something uglier, and when he walked into the great hall during the evening meal, Ilara knew immediately that something was wrong. He wasn't alone. Behind him came a woman Ilara had hoped never to see again, Aunt Helga, the woman who'd taken her in after her mother died, not out of kindness, but because orphans made excellent unpaid labor. The woman who'd told her daily that she was worthless, ugly, stupid. The woman who'd eventually sold her to the castle kitchens for a handful of silver coins. Ilara's blood turned to ice. "Your Majesty," Lord Marin announced, his voice carrying across the hall. "I've brought someone who has grave concerns about the woman you've been keeping in your chambers." Callan's hand tightened on his goblet. His expression didn't change, but Ilara could feel the dangerous energy radiating from him. "I haven't been keeping anyone," he said flatly. "Ilara is my mate. She stays of her own free will." "Does she?" Lord Marin's smile was oily. "Her aunt tells a different story. She says the girl is simple-minded, damaged, that she was sent to the kitchens because she couldn't be trusted with anything more complex than scrubbing pots." Aunt Helga stepped forward, wringing her hands in a performance of concern that made Ilara's stomach turn. "Your Majesty, please. The poor dear doesn't know what she's doing. She's been touched in the head since childhood. She can't even speak. How can she consent to anything when she can't understand what's being asked of her?" The words hit like physical blows. Simple-minded, damaged, touched in the head. Ilara had heard them all before, had internalized them so deeply that some part of her still believed they were true. Maybe they were. Maybe she was fooling herself, thinking she could be a king's mate. Maybe she was too broken for this, too damaged, too... "Enough!" Callan's voice cut through the hall like a blade. He rose from his seat, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. "You dare," he said softly, descending from the dais, "come into my hall and insult my mate." Lord Marin paled but held his ground. "Your Majesty, I'm only trying to protect you from..." "From what? From the only person in 200 years who can touch me without screaming? From the woman fate itself chose for me?" He stopped in front of Aunt Helga, towering over her. "You sold this girl like livestock. You told her she was worthless. You beat her until she forgot how to speak." Aunt Helga's mask of concern slipped. "I never..." "Don't lie to me." His voice dropped to a growl. "I've seen her scars. I've held her through nightmares about what you did to her. You don't get to stand in my hall and pretend you care about her well-being." The entire court was silent, watching, waiting. Ilara should have felt vindicated, protected. Instead, she felt exposed. Everyone was looking at her, seeing her trauma laid bare for public consumption. The damaged girl, the broken thing the king had taken pity on. She couldn't breathe. She stood abruptly, knocking her chair back, and fled. She ran through corridors she barely knew, past startled servants and confused guards, until she found herself in the library, her sanctuary. She pressed her back against the shelves and slid to the floor, pulling her knees to her chest. What was she doing? She didn't belong here. She was a kitchen servant with a broken voice and a shattered past. Lord Maren was right. Aunt Helga was right. She couldn't be what Kaelan needed. She would only embarrass him, hold him back, prove to everyone that the curse had broken him worse than the witch ever intended. She should leave, slip out tonight before she made things worse. He'd be sad for a while, but he'd recover. He'd find someone better, someone whole. The library door opened. Kaelan stood in the doorway, his chest heaving like he'd run the entire way. His eyes found her immediately, crumpled on the floor between the shelves. "Ilara." Relief flooded his voice. "Thank the gods. I thought—" He stopped, took a breath. "May I come closer?" She should tell him no, should push him away before she lost the courage. But she nodded, because she was weak, because she wanted him near even when she knew she should run. He crossed the room and knelt in front of her, close enough to touch, but waiting for permission. "They're wrong," he said. "Everything they said. It's wrong. You know that, don't you?" She shook her head. Tears were streaming down her face. "Ilara." He reached out, cradled her face in his hands. "Look at me, please." She looked. "You are not simple-minded. You are not damaged. You are the strongest person I have ever met." His voice cracked. "Do you understand what it takes to survive what you survived? To keep going when everyone around you is telling you you're worthless? That takes more strength than any warrior I've ever known." She wanted to believe him. Gods, she wanted to. "I know you're thinking about leaving," he continued. "I can feel it through the bond. You think you're not good enough, that you'll hold me back, that I deserve better." She nodded miserably. "Then let me tell you what I deserve." He pressed his forehead to hers. "I deserve a mate who sees me as a man, not just a king, who touches me without fear, who sits with me in silence and makes me feel less alone than I've ever felt with anyone who could speak." His thumbs brushed the tears from her cheeks. "I deserve you, Ilara, and you deserve so much more than you've ever let yourself believe." A sob escaped her, broken and raw. "Stay," he whispered. "Please. I'm not commanding you. I'm asking. Stay with me. Choose me. Let me spend the rest of my very long life proving to you that you are worthy of love." She could leave. She could walk out right now and disappear into the night. But she didn't want to. She was tired of running, tired of hiding, tired of believing the lies that had been carved into her since childhood. She wanted to be brave, just this once. She reached up and pulled his face to hers. This kiss wasn't soft, wasn't tentative. It was a declaration, a choice. She poured everything she couldn't say into it. "Yes, I choose you. Yes, I'll stay. Yes, I'm yours." He groaned against her mouth, pulling her into his lap, wrapping his arms around her like he was afraid she'd vanish. "Mine," he breathed when they broke apart. "Say you're mine. I know you can. I don't care if it's the only word you ever speak. Just give me that." Ilara looked into his eyes, grey like winter storms, desperate and hopeful and terrified all at once. She opened her mouth, felt the familiar lock in her throat, but this time she pushed through. "Yours." The word came out rough, broken, barely more than a whisper. But it came out. Kaelin's eyes widened, filled with tears. Again, he begged. Please, say it again. Yours. Stronger this time, clearer. I'm yours. He kissed her again, laughing and crying at the same time, and she held him tight and let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, she really was worth keeping. The bonding ceremony took place 3 days later. Ilara had expected something small, private. She was still a kitchen servant in the eyes of most of the court, still the silent girl with no family and no standing. But Kaelin had other ideas. Everyone will witness this, he'd told her, his jaw set with determination. Every noble, every servant, every person in this kingdom will watch me claim you as my queen. No one will ever again question whether you belong at my side. So she stood in the great hall, the same hall where she'd spilled wine on Lord Maren's coat, where she'd first touched the untouchable king, wearing a gown of midnight blue velvet with silver embroidery. Her hair had been washed and braided with tiny winter flowers. She looked like someone else entirely, someone who mattered. The hall was packed, every seat filled, people standing along the walls. She recognized faces from the kitchen, the cook who'd given her extra scraps when no one was looking, the scullery maid who'd shared her blanket on cold nights. They were crying, smiling, proud. Kaelin stood at the altar, dressed in black and silver, looking at her like she was the sun rising after an endless night. She walked toward him on trembling legs. No one to give her away, no family to witness. But she didn't need them. She'd never needed them. She needed only him. When she reached the altar, he took her hands in his. The touch still sent warmth flooding through her veins. She wondered if it would always feel like this. She hoped so. Before these witnesses, the officiant intoned, "Do you, Kaelin, king of the Lycans, take this woman as your bonded mate? Your partner in rule and in life? Your queen?" "I do." His voice was steady. His eyes never left hers. "I have waited 200 years for her. I would wait 200 more." "And do you, Ilara, take this man as your bonded mate? Your partner in rule and in life? Your king?" She could feel every eye in the hall on her, waiting, wondering if the silent girl would speak. She took a breath, felt Kaelin's hands tighten around hers, giving her strength. "I do." Her voice was soft, but it carried. A gasp rippled through the crowd. The officiant smiled. "Then by the ancient laws of our people, I declare you bonded. What fate has joined, let no force sunder." Kaelin pulled her into his arms and kissed her, deep and thorough, in front of everyone. The hall erupted in cheers. When they finally broke apart, he pressed his forehead to hers. "I love you," he murmured, low enough that only she could hear. "I should have said it before. I love you, Ilara. I think I've loved you since you took my hand at the feast." Tears spilled down her cheeks. Happy tears. The kind she'd never thought she'd cry. "I love you too." The words came easier now, still rough, still hesitant, but real. "I love you." His smile could have lit the entire kingdom. The celebration lasted well into the night. Ilara danced for the first time in her life, badly, laughing at her own missteps, while Kaelin guided her patiently across the floor. She ate food she couldn't name and drank wine that made her head swim pleasantly. She was introduced to nobles who bowed to her, addressed her as Your Majesty, treated her with the respect she'd never dared to dream of receiving. But the best part came later. Lord Maren and Aunt Helga had been arrested the night of their accusation. They'd been held in comfortable chambers. Kaelin wasn't cruel, but they'd been made to wait, to wonder, to fear. Now they were brought before the new queen. Ilara sat on the throne beside her husband, wearing her crown for the first time. It felt heavy, foreign, but she didn't let that show. Lord Marin fell to his knees immediately. "Your Majesty, please. I was only trying to protect the king." "You were trying to protect yourself," Kaelin cut in coldly. "You resented that a kitchen servant could do what no noblewoman ever could, that she was chosen where you and your allies were passed over." Aunt Helga tried a different approach. She looked up at Ilara with wide, desperate eyes. "Ilara, darling, surely you remember. I took you in when no one else would. I fed you, clothed you. You starved her." Kaelin's voice was ice. "You beat her. You sold her. And now you dare to call her darling?" Ilara raised her hand, and her husband fell silent, waiting, trusting her to handle this. She looked at her aunt, this woman who had made her childhood a nightmare, who had convinced her she was worthless, who had tried, even now, to take away the only good thing that had ever happened to her. She should have felt rage, hatred, the desire for revenge. Instead, she felt something unexpected. Pity. "You tried to break me," she said. Her voice was quiet but steady. "You almost succeeded. But I'm still here. And I'm not broken." Aunt Helga's face went pale. "I could have you executed." Ilara watched her aunt flinch. "I could have you thrown in the dungeons. I could do to you everything you did to me." She paused. Let the fear sink in. "But I won't." She straightened in her throne. "You'll be banished, both of you, stripped of your titles, your lands, your wealth. You'll spend the rest of your lives knowing that the girl you called worthless sits on the throne you'll never touch." Lord Marin sputtered. Aunt Helga began to wail. Ilara felt nothing but peace. "Let them choke on their own bitterness," she murmured as the guards dragged them away. "That's punishment enough." Kaelin reached over and took her hand. "Well said, my queen." She smiled at him, her husband, her mate, her home. 2 years later, Ilara stood in the castle garden watching the snow fall. So much had changed. Her voice had returned fully, still soft, still careful, but present. She laughed now, spoke her opinions in council meetings, read stories aloud to the children who visited the castle during festivals. She was no longer afraid. Behind her, the door opened. Familiar footsteps crossed the terrace. Kaelin's arms wrapped around her from behind, his chin resting on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" "The night we met." She leaned back against his chest. "How terrified I was. How certain I was that you would hurt me." "And now?" She turned in his arms, looking up at him. His grey eyes were warm now, soft. The cold mask he'd worn for 2 centuries had melted away completely, leaving only the man beneath. "Now I can't imagine being afraid of you." She rose on her toes and kissed him gently. "Now I know I'm exactly where I belong." He pulled her closer, deepening the kiss, and she melted into him the way she always did. When they broke apart, he pressed a hand to her stomach, still flat, but not for much longer. "Have you thought about names?" he asked. "A few." She covered his hand with hers. "We have time." "We have forever," he corrected. "And I intend to spend every moment of it loving you." She smiled. The silent girl who'd been sold for silver coins, the broken servant who'd reached for a cursed king's hand. The queen who'd found her voice and her worth in the arms of her fated mate. She was no longer invisible, no longer worthless, no longer afraid. She was loved. She was home. She was exactly where she was always meant to be. And she was happy. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like and subscribe for more tales of fated mates, cursed kings, and the women who break their chains. New stories every week. Until next time.